She was 19 years old, and everything she owned fit inside a canvas bag no bigger than a bread loaf, $12, a change of clothes, a bar of soap, and a carving knife with an applewood handle that an old man had made for her, the only gift she had ever received that wasn't given out of obligation. That was it. That was the sum total of what Clara Whitfield carried the day her father signed the paper that put her out of his house. Not her stepmother, her father, his hand, his ink, his name on the line. She didn't scream, she didn't pound on the locked door. She had learned from a quiet old carpenter who spoke more with his hands than his mouth that you do not waste your strength on wood that has already rotted through. You pick up your tools, you find new timber, and you begin again. So she walked 4 days west into the Cobalt Mountains toward a valley she had never seen to buy a stone cabin that everyone in the territory said was cursed. She paid $12 for it, every last cent, and she would later say it was the best money she ever spent. But that was before she lifted the Hearthstone, before she found what the dead family had buried beneath it, and before the richest man in the valley decided that what was hers had always been his. She was 19 years old, and everything she owned fit inside a canvas bag no bigger than a bread loaf, $12, a change of clothes, a bar of soap, and a carving knife with an applewood handle that an old man had made for her, the only gift she had ever received that wasn't given out of obligation. That was it. That was the sum total of what Clara Whitfield carried the day her father signed the paper that put her out of his house. Not her stepmother, her father, his hand, his ink, his name on the line. She didn't scream, she didn't pound on the locked door. She had learned from a quiet old carpenter who spoke more with his hands than his mouth that you do not waste your strength on wood that has already rotted through. You pick up your tools, you find new timber, and you begin again. So she walked 4 days west into the Cobalt Mountains toward a valley she had never seen to buy a stone cabin that everyone in the territory said was cursed. She paid $12 for it, every last cent, and she would later say it was the best money she ever spent. But that was before she lifted the Hearthstone, before she found what the dead family had buried beneath it, and before the richest man in the valley decided that what was hers had always been his. But to understand how Clara Whitfield ended up standing in front of a ruined cabin in a place called Whisper Creek Valley with nothing but $12 and a dead man's knife, you have to go back to the beginning, back to Mill Creek, Pennsylvania, and the small tidy house on the eastern edge of town where a girl once believed the world was a safe and knowable thing. Clara was born in the spring of 1888. The house she came into was painted white with green shutters, and it sat at the end of a quiet lane bordered by sugar maples that turned the color of fire every October. It was not a grand house, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a sitting room with a pot-belly stove that ticked and popped through the long winters. But it was warm and it was certain, and for the first 7 years of Clara's life it was the whole world. Her mother was the center of that world. Ruth Whitfield was a woman of small stature and enormous quiet presence. She had dark hair that she wore pinned up during the day but let fall to her waist in the evenings, and her hands always seemed to carry the scent of whatever she had been doing, most recently bread dough, lavender, soap, the damp earth of her garden. She was not a loud woman, she did not need to be. When Ruth Whitfield walked into a room, the room rearranged itself around her the way iron filings align to a magnet, without force, without effort, simply because of what she was. She taught Clara things, not in the way a schoolteacher teaches with chalk and recitation and the threat of the ruler, but in the way a river teaches the stones in its bed slowly, constantly, by the sheer patient force of her presence. She taught Clara the names of the constellations. On clear nights they would lie on a blanket in the yard, and Ruth would trace the shapes with her finger against the sky. There is Orion, she would say. See his belt, 3 stars in a line. And there that bright one that is Sirius, the dog star. It is the brightest star we can see from here. It has been shining for longer than anyone can imagine. Clara would listen, her small body pressed against her mother's warmth, and she would feel the immensity of the sky, not as something frightening, but as something wonderful. Her mother made the universe feel like a story being told just for her. Ruth taught her to identify the birds that nested in the eaves of their house. Barn swallows with their rust-colored throats and their forked tails that cut the air like scissors. She taught her which wildflowers were safe to touch and which would give you a rash, and how to tell the difference between the track of a rabbit and the track of a fox in fresh snow. She read to Clara every night before bed, stories of brave girls in distant lands, of talking animals and enchanted forests, but also stories of real women who had done real things, women who had crossed oceans, who had built schools, who had refused to be told what they could not do. The book Clara loved the most was a collection of folk tales her mother kept on the bedside table. It had a green cloth cover worn soft at the edges, and it smelled of lavender and old paper. Ruth would read from it in a low, steady voice, and Clara would fall asleep to the sound of words that felt as solid and reliable as the walls of the house itself. Her father was a different kind of presence. Harlan Whitfield worked as a clerk for the Allegheny Lumber Company, a man of neat ledgers and precise penmanship, who left for the office at 7 each morning and returned at 6 each evening. He was not unkind. He loved his daughter, but his love was expressed in shy, infrequent gestures, a hand placed briefly on the top of her head as he passed a peppermint candy left on her pillow without explanation, a quiet nod of approval when she showed him a drawing she had made. He was a man who lived inside his own head, inside the orderly world of columns and figures that made sense to him in a way that people often did not. He was not cold exactly. He was simply not equipped for the loud, messy, demanding work of showing love. He left that to Ruth the way he left the cooking and the gardening and the naming of stars. These were things that belonged to her department, and he trusted her to handle them the way his employer trusted him to keep the accounts straight. And for 7 years, this arrangement held. The house on the lane was a small, complete universe with Ruth at its center, holding everything together with the quiet gravity of her love. Then the fever came. It arrived in Mill Creek in the autumn of 1895, carried, some said, by a traveler who had come through on the mail coach from Pittsburgh. It moved through the town the way a brush fire moves through dry grass, fast, indiscriminate, and merciless. It took the youngest daughter of the Methodist minister. It took old Mr. Haskell, who ran the feed store. It took 2 of the Murphy children in the same week. And on a gray Tuesday in late October, it took Ruth Whitfield. Clara was 7 years old. She stood in the doorway of her parents' bedroom and watched her mother's chest rise and fall, each breath shallower than the last, like a tide going out. The room smelled of camphor and sweat and something else, something Clara would later recognize as the smell of a body that is already leaving even while the heart still beats. Ruth's eyes found Clara's in the dim light. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She raised one thin hand, the hand that had pointed out constellations, that had braided Clara's hair, that had kneaded bread and pulled weeds and turned the pages of the green book every night, and she reached toward her daughter. Clara took her mother's hand. It was hot and dry like a stone that has been sitting in the sun. She held it and she did not let go. Not when the hand grew still, not when the breathing stopped, not when her father came into the room and made a sound that Clara had never heard before and never wanted to hear again. A single ragged sob that seemed to tear itself from somewhere deep inside his chest like a nail being pulled from old wood. They buried Ruth Whitfield in the cemetery behind the Lutheran church beneath a sugar maple that was just beginning to turn gold. Clara stood at the graveside in a black dress that had been hastily altered from one of her mother's, and she did not cry, not because she did not want to, but because she felt that if she started, she would never stop, and the crying would swallow her whole, the way the earth was swallowing her mother's coffin, and there would be nothing left of her at all. The house changed after that. It was the same house, same white paint, same green shutters, same potbelly stove, but the thing that had made it alive was gone. The scent of bread and lavender faded, the evening reading stopped, the blanket in the yard where they had watched the stars was folded and put away in a trunk, and the trunk was pushed into a corner, and the corner grew dusty. Highland Whitfield retreated into his ledgers. He brought work home in the evenings, now spreading his papers across the dining table with a kind of desperate focus, as if the columns of numbers could impose order on a world that had become unbearably chaotic. He did not know how to be a father without Ruth there to translate between his quiet inner world and the needs of a 7-year-old girl. He tried in his way. He still left peppermint candies on her pillow. He still nodded when she showed him things. But the gap between them, the gap that Ruth had always bridged, grew wider and wider until it became a silence so deep that neither of them knew how to cross it anymore. A year later, Harlan married again. Her name was Prudence Aldridge. She was a widow from a neighboring town, a woman in her late 30s with a long, sharp face and hands that were always in motion, smoothing tablecloths, straightening picture frames, counting coins from a small tin box she kept in the kitchen. She was not cruel. That would have been easier to bear. Cruelty has heat to it, and heat at least is something. Prudence was simply cold. She was as practical and unadorned as a river stone, a woman who understood the world entirely in terms of budgets and duties and the efficient management of limited resources. She kept a clean house. She managed the money with fierce efficiency. She cooked meals that were nutritious and economical and completely without joy, boiled potatoes, plain gravy, overcooked vegetables served in precise portions. She did not read to Clara at bedtime. She did not lie in the yard and name stars. She looked at Clara the way she looked at a line item in a household budget, an expense to be managed, a duty to be fulfilled, a mouth to be fed until such time as it could be expected to feed itself. Clara did not hate Prudence. Hate requires a kind of engagement, a recognition that the other person matters enough to inspire strong feeling. What Clara felt was something worse. She felt invisible. She felt like a piece of furniture that Prudence had inherited along with the house, something to be dusted and maintained but never truly seen. In this quiet, emotionally barren landscape, Clara found a strange and unexpected refuge. The workshop belonged to their neighbor Amos Birch. It sat about 60 yards from the Whitfield house on the other side of a low stone wall that separated the two properties. It was a simple structure, post and beam, with a shingled roof and wide double doors that Amos left open whenever the weather allowed. From those open doors came a constant stream of sounds and smells that Clara found irresistible: the rasp of a hand saw, the tap of a mallet, the sweet resinous scent of fresh cut pine, the sharper tang of oak shavings. Amos Birch was a carpenter and a widower. He was in his late 60s, a tall man who had begun to stoop under the weight of years and loss. His wife Margareta had died of consumption a decade earlier. His only son Jonas had been killed in a logging accident in the mountains of West Virginia when he was 23. A falling tree, a moment of inattention, a life ended in the time it takes to draw a single breath. Amos did not speak about Jonas, not to anyone, but the evidence of the boy was everywhere in the workshop. A pair of work gloves hanging from a nail by the door, stiff with age, a half-finished birdhouse on a shelf, the wood gray with dust, and in the corner by the window where the light was best, a simple wooden chair with a woven seat. Jonas's chair, no one sat in it. It was not forbidden, not explicitly. But everyone who entered the workshop understood in the way that people understand the sacred without being told that the chair was not for sitting. Amos's hands were gnarled and permanently stained with wood pitch, the knuckles swollen with arthritis that he never complained about. But those hands moved with a slow, certain grace that Clara found mesmerizing. She would stand at the edge of his property just outside the open doors of the workshop and watch him work. She watched the way he held a chisel, not gripping it, but guiding it the way you might guide a horse with a light touch on the reins. She watched the long curling ribbons of wood peel away from a plank as he pushed the plane across its surface. She watched and she wanted with a hunger that surprised her to know how to do what he did. Amos saw her, he always saw her, but he never invited her in with words. Amos Birch was not a man who trusted words. Words were slippery things, easy to say and easier to break. He trusted wood and iron and the evidence of a person's hands. One afternoon in the early autumn of her 8th year, Clara came to stand at her usual spot by the workshop doors. Amos was inside sharpening a plain blade on an oil stone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the air like a kind of music. Without looking up, without saying a word, he reached to a shelf beside him, picked up a small block of soft white pine and a whittling knife and set them on a stump just inside the doorway. Then he went back to his sharpening. Clara stared at the block and the knife for a long time. She understood what was being offered, not a gift, not a toy, an invitation that was also a test. She stepped across the threshold, picked up the block and the knife and sat down on the floor with her back against the wall. She did not know what to carve. She did not know how to hold the knife. She made clumsy, uncertain cuts that sent small chips of wood scattering across the floor. The blade slipped once and nicked her thumb, and she pressed the cut against her dress without making a sound. Amos watched all of this from the corner of his eye. He watched the way she did not give up. He watched the way she did not cry over the cut. He watched the way she studied the grain of the wood, turning the block this way and that, trying to understand which direction the knife wanted to go. After an hour, she had produced nothing recognizable. But she had learned something. She had learned that the wood had a will of its own, a direction, a grain, and that you could not force it. You had to work with it, to read it, to listen to what it was telling you. She came back the next day, and the day after that, and every day after school for the next 11 years. From that first afternoon, the workshop became Clara's school, her sanctuary, and the only place in the world where she felt fully seen. Amos taught her everything he knew. Not through lectures, not through books, through quiet demonstration, through the patient repetition of showing her a thing and then stepping back to watch her try it. He showed her how to read the grain of a piece of oak, how to see the cathedral pattern in a quarter-sawn board and know which way the wood would want to move as it dried. He taught her to feel the readiness of a freshly sharpened plane blade by running the ball of her thumb across the edge, not along it, never along it, but across, so you could feel the tiny wire burr that told you the steel had been brought to its keenest point. She learned the different sounds a handsaw makes when it bites into different woods. Maple sang a high, sweet note, pine whispered, oak growled. She learned to mix lime mortar by feel, not too wet, not too dry, judging its readiness by the way it clung to the trowel and then released with a clean snap. She learned to lay field stone so that each stone locked against its neighbor's weight, bearing on weight the whole structure, gaining strength from the compression of its parts, the way an arch draws its power from the downward force of gravity. These were not small things. These were the ancient arts of building passed down through 1,000 generations of human hands. And Amos gave them to Clara with the same quiet generosity with which he gave her the block of pine on that first day, without fanfare, without condition, simply because he saw in her the capacity to receive them. He never praised her directly. That was not his way. But Clara learned to read his silences the way she had learned to read the grain of wood. A grunt meant she was on the right track. A long silence meant she was making a mistake and needed to stop and think. And the rarest thing of all, a single slow nod meant she had done something that met his standard. The first time she earned that nod was the day she cut her first dovetail joint. She had been working on it for 3 days, measuring, cutting, chiseling, fitting, failing, starting over. The dovetail is the mark of a real woodworker, a joint where two pieces of wood interlock like the fingers of clasped hands, each piece holding the other, the whole stronger than its parts. It is beautiful in its logic and unforgiving in its execution. A gap of a sixteenth of an inch is a failure. On the third day, the pieces came together. She pushed them into place and felt the slight, satisfying resistance of wood meeting wood in a perfect fit. She held the joined pieces up to the light and could see no gap. No light came through. Amos came over. He took the joint from her hands and turned it slowly, examining it from every angle. He ran his calloused finger over the interlocking pieces, feeling for any imperfection. Then he gave the nod. One nod, slow, deliberate. The corners of his mouth did not move, but something shifted behind his eyes, something that might have been pride or recognition or the bittersweet satisfaction of seeing a skill you love carried forward by hands that are not your own. That nod was more precious to Clara than any ribbon or award she could have received. It was worth more than words because it could not be faked. You cannot nod like that at mediocre work. The nod was the truth, and the truth was that she had done something well and that a man she respected had seen it. The years passed. Clara grew from a watchful child into a capable young woman. Her hands, once small and uncertain, became strong and sure. She could sharpen a blade so fine it would shave the hair from her arm. She could look at a piece of timber and tell you where it had grown, how old it was, and whether it had been felled in spring or winter. She could build a shelf, frame a wall, hang a door, and lay a stone foundation that would hold for a century. The people of Mill Creek did not quite know what to make of her. A girl who spent her days in an old man's workshop, who smelled of sawdust and linseed oil instead of rose water and talcum powder. She did not attend the socials at the church hall. She did not giggle with the other girls about boys and dresses and the new hat Mrs. Patterson had ordered from Philadelphia. She was quiet and self-contained, and she carried herself with a kind of watchful competence that some people found unsettling, the way a well-sharpened tool can unsettle someone who doesn't understand its purpose. Prudence, her stepmother, regarded Clara's apprenticeship with Amos as a peculiar but ultimately harmless eccentricity, like a fondness for collecting insects. As long as Clara did her chores and stayed out of the way, Prudence did not concern herself with how the girl spent her time. Clara was in Prudence's accounting an expense that would eventually move off the books, and the sooner the better. One afternoon, when Clara was perhaps 12, she was in the workshop shaping a table leg on the lathe. Amos was at his bench hemplaning a board. The silence between them was the comfortable silence of two people who do not need to fill the air with noise. Then Clara's foot slipped from the treadle and the lathe stopped abruptly. She looked over at the corner of the workshop at Jonas's chair. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Amos did not stop planing. "You can ask." "Your son, Jonas, what was he like?" The plane stopped mid-stroke. Amos stood very still for a moment, his hands flat on the board. Clara thought she had made a terrible mistake. Then Amos picked up the plane and resumed his work, and without looking at her, he said, "He was kind. He had big hands like mine, but he was gentle with them. He could pick up a baby bird that had fallen from its nest, and you'd think he was holding a piece of glass." A pause. 3 strokes of the plane. "He would have been a better carpenter than me if he'd had the time." That was all he said about Jonas, ever, but it was enough. Clara understood that she had been given something rare, a piece of Amos Birch's heart offered once and never to be asked for again. There was a chair in the workshop, Jonas's chair. Clara had never sat in it. No one had not in all the years she had been coming to the workshop. It stood in its corner by the window, gathering dust, a monument to absence. One summer afternoon, when Clara was 14, she had been working since morning on a particularly stubborn piece of hickory. Her arms ached, her back was sore, and the heat was pressing down on the workshop like a heavy hand. She needed to sit, and without thinking, truly without thinking, she crossed the workshop and sank into Jonas's chair. The moment she realized what she had done, she froze. She looked at Amos. He was standing at his bench, a chisel in one hand, watching her. His face was unreadable. The silence lasted a long time, long enough for Clara to feel her heart begin to hammer against her ribs, long enough for the sweat on her palms to turn cold. Then Amos looked away, back at his work, and said quietly, "Chair needs to be used." 4 words. But Clara heard what lived beneath them. She heard an old man who had kept the chair empty for years because filling it would mean accepting that his son was never coming back. She heard him accepting it now. She heard him saying without saying it that the girl who sat in that chair was not a replacement for the boy who had sat there before her, but she was something. She was here. She was real, and that was enough. Clara sat in Jonas's chair from that day forward. And something between her and Amos shifted, settled like a foundation stone finding its final resting place. They were not father and daughter, they were not master and apprentice. They were something that does not have a name in the language, two people who recognized in each other a wound that rhymed and who had decided without ever discussing it to sit beside each other while it healed. For her 16th birthday, Amos gave Clara a gift. He presented it without ceremony, simply holding it out to her when she arrived at the workshop that morning, the way you might hand someone a tools they needed for the day's work. It was a carving knife. The blade was fine Swedish steel ground to a edge, so keen that it caught the light and threw it back in a thin, bright line. The handle was carved from a piece of apple wood from the tree in Amos's own yard. Clara realized the old gnarled tree that bore small tart apples every September. He had shaped the handle to fit a specific hand, her hand. When she wrapped her fingers around it, the wood settled against her palm as if it had grown there. It was not a trinket. It was not a pretty thing meant to sit on a shelf. It was a tool. And a tool is a statement of faith. It says, I believe you will use this well. I believe you are capable of the work this tool is meant to do. I see what you are becoming and I trust you to become it. Clara carried that knife with her every day from that moment on. She wore it in a simple leather sheath on her belt, and the weight of it against her hip became as familiar and as necessary as the weight of her own hand. It was the first object she had ever owned that felt like it was truly hers, not inherited, not borrowed, not given as a duty, but made for her by someone who knew her because he wanted her to have it. The day she was cast out came on a Tuesday in late September 1907. The air was crisp with the first bite of autumn, and the sugar maples along the lane were just beginning to turn. Clara had spent the morning at Amos's workshop helping him repair a section of fence that a fallen branch had damaged in a late summer storm. Her shoulders ached with the satisfying ache of good work done well, and she walked home with sawdust in her hair and the smell of fresh cut cedar on her clothes. The front door was locked. This was unusual. Prudence was fastidious about many things, but she rarely locked the door during the day. Clara tried the handle twice, then stepped back and looked at the porch. Her canvas bag sat on the top step, the bag she used for carrying books or supplies from town. It was packed, not full. There was not much to fill it with, but packed with deliberate care. A change of clothes folded with Prudence's characteristic precision, a bar of soap, and the green cloth book with the folk tales inside, the one that had belonged to her mother. The only thing of roots that Clara had been allowed to keep. Pinned to the bag was a folded piece of paper. Clara's heart did not race. It grew still and heavy in her chest, a cold, smooth stone settling to the bottom of a creek. She recognized the handwriting. Sharp, economical, perfectly legible, Prudence's hand. She unpinned the note and read it. Clara, you are 19 now, a woman grown. It is time you made your own way. Your father and I have done our duty by you. Your things are in this bag. We wish you well. Do not return here. It would be an inconvenience. There was no signature, none was needed. Clara folded the note and put it in her pocket. Then she looked through the front window, and what she saw there was worse than the locked door, worse than the note, worse than anything Prudence could have written in her sharp, economical hand. Harlan Whitfield was sitting at the dining table. He was not staring at his ledgers. He was not turned away. He was signing a document. A single sheet of paper laid out before him. Prudence stood beside him, waiting, her arms crossed. Harlan's pen moved across the paper, the same neat, careful penmanship he used for the lumber company's accounts, and then he set the pen down and pushed the paper toward his wife. He knew, he had agreed, he had signed. This was not the passive surrender of a weak man who could not stand up to a strong woman. This was an act, a deliberate, documented act committed in ink with his name on the line. Clara's father had not merely failed to protect her, he had authorized her removal the way he might authorize the disposal of surplus inventory at the lumber yard. She had been written off, balanced out, cleared from the books. Clara stood at the window for a long moment, watching her father sit motionless at the table, staring at the document he had just signed. She waited for him to look up. She waited for him to turn toward the window, to see her standing there, to show some flicker of shame or regret, or the love she still believed was in him somewhere buried beneath the ledgers and the grief and the years of silence. He did not look up. She turned away from the window. She picked up the bag. She slid the carving knife from its sheath just to feel the familiar weight of the apple wood handle in her palm, and then she slid it back. She had learned from Amos that you do not waste energy on things you cannot fix. You assess the material you have, you take up your tools, and you begin the work that is in front of you. But before she began the work, she went to say goodbye. Amos was in his workshop as always. He was sitting in his own chair, not working, just sitting. When Clara appeared in the doorway with the bag on her shoulder, he looked at her and she saw that he already knew. Perhaps he had seen the preparations through his window. Perhaps he had simply known the way old trees know when a storm is coming by some deep intuition rooted in years of watching the sky. He stood up slowly. His hands, she noticed, were trembling. Not much. A fine, barely perceptible vibration like the last ring of a struck bell. She had never seen Amos's hands tremble before. Those hands had been the steadiest things in her world. He coughed a dry, hollow sound that came from deep in his chest and turned away to hide it. But Clara heard it. And in that cough, in the trembling of those gnarled and pitch-stained hands, she heard something that she did not fully understand until much later. She heard an old man's body beginning to fail. She heard time running out. Amos reached into the pocket of his leather apron and produced a folded scrap of paper. He held it out to her. On it, in his careful, blocky handwriting, were two words whispered Creek Valley. I worked out that way once, he said. 40 years ago. Good water, good stone. There's a cabin up the creek, stone and log. A man named Caldwell built it. Good man, good work. The place has been empty a long time. He paused and looked at Clara with an expression she had never seen on his weathered face before, something raw and unguarded, something that might have been fear. It's a hard place, but you're ready for hard places. Clara took the paper. She looked at the two words written there and understood something that made her chest tighten. Amos had not written this just now. The paper was worn at the creases as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. He had been carrying it for days, maybe weeks. He had known this was coming. He had known, perhaps before Clara herself had known, that Prudence would push Harlan to sign the paper, that the locked door was inevitable, that Clara would need somewhere to go. He had been preparing for this, the knife, the years of teaching, the skills he had placed in her hands like tools in a belt. And now this, a destination, a direction, a place where those skills could be put to use. He had not been merely teaching her a trade, he had been arming her for a life he knew she would have to build alone. She wanted to say something. She wanted to tell him what he had meant to her, what the workshop had meant, what Jonas's chair and the nod and the knife had meant. But the words were too big for her mouth, and she knew they both knew that words were not the language they shared. So she stepped forward and put her arms around him. He was thinner than she expected, his frame bony beneath the leather apron, and she could feel the labored rise and fall of his breathing against her cheek. He smelled of wood shavings and linseed oil and pipe tobacco, the scent of 10,000 afternoons. He put one hand on the back of her head just for a moment, the way a man blesses something he is letting go. Then he stepped back, cleared his throat, and said, "Mind the mortar in cold weather. Double the lime." Clara almost smiled, almost. She shouldered her bag, slid the scrap of paper into her pocket beside Prudence's note, the two documents side by side, one an eviction and the other a map, and she walked away from the workshop, away from the White House with the green shutters, away from the lane of sugar maples, away from everything she had ever known. She did not look back. Looking back was not a thing she could afford. The road west unspooled before her like a ribbon of dust and packed earth winding through the rolling farmland of central Pennsylvania. For the first 2 days, the landscape was familiar, tidy homesteads with smoke curling from their chimneys, split rail fences bordering fields of late corn, and winter wheat, the distant lowing of cattle. The air smelled of hay and livestock, of wood smoke and damp earth, and the faint, sweet rot of fallen apples in untended orchards. No one paid her much mind. A young woman walking alone with a bag on her shoulder was not a common sight, but neither was it remarkable enough to warrant more than a passing glance. She was just another figure on the road, moving with a purpose that discouraged questions. She slept in barns when she could find one with an unlocked door, burrowing into the hay for warmth and waking before dawn to slip away before the farmer found her. She ate sparingly the last of the bread and cheese she'd had in her pocket, then a small meal bought at a crossroads store with a few of the coins she had saved from odd jobs over the years. The physical act of walking was a strange comfort. The steady rhythm of her own feet on the road, the swing of her arms, the deep pull of air into her lungs. It was a kind of work, and work was something she understood. It was the language she was most fluent in, the thing that connected her to Amos and to the best version of herself. The rhythm of walking kept the hollowness in her chest from consuming her entirely. As long as she was moving, as long as there was ground to cover and a destination ahead, the grief could not catch up with her. On the third day, the landscape changed. The gentle hills gave way to steeper inclines. The farms grew smaller and farther apart, then disappeared altogether, replaced by dense stands of hemlock and white pine that pressed close to the road and blocked out the sky. The air grew thinner, sharper, carrying the cold mineral scent of stone and the sweet resinous tang of evergreen. The road became a track, then a trail, winding upward into the foothills of the Cobalt Mountains. This was unfamiliar territory, wilder and more formidable than the neat ordered world she had left behind. She saw deer moving through the trees at dusk, their bodies flickering between the trunks like brown ghosts. She heard the cry of a red-tailed hawk circling high overhead, its shadow passing across her path like a dark blessing. On the third night, she slept in an abandoned woodcutter's shed. The roof leaked in 2 places, and the floor was thick with old leaves and mouse droppings. She lay on her back in the darkness and watched the stars through the holes in the roof, and for the first time since her mother's death, she named them. There is Orion, there is his belt, and there that bright one that is Sirius, the dog star. Ruth's voice coming to her across the years, as clear and steady as if her mother were lying beside her on the old blanket in the yard. Clara pressed her hand against her chest and felt the green book there inside the bag she was using as a pillow, and she understood that her mother was not entirely gone. Ruth lived in the names of stars, in the knowledge of which flowers to touch and which to avoid, in the ability to look up at a vast and indifferent sky and find in it not emptiness but a story. On the evening of the fourth day, she crested a high ridge and saw the valley. Whisper Creek Valley was a deep green bowl carved between two towering peaks, their upper slopes dusted with the first snow of early autumn. A silver creek wound through the valley floor like a vein of mercury, catching the last light of the setting sun and throwing it back in bright, broken fragments. A handful of lights twinkled near the valley's mouth, a tiny settlement clinging to the edge of the wilderness like a barnacle on a ship's hull. Clara stood on the ridge for a long time, her bag on her shoulder, the wind pulling at her hair. The sun was setting behind the western peak, painting the sky in shades of rose and violet and deep aching gold. The beauty of it was almost too much. It pressed against her chest like a fist. She felt a stillness settle over her. Not peace exactly, she was too hungry and too tired and too uncertain for peace, but a kind of recognition. This place was not welcoming. It was not gentle. It did not promise safety or comfort or an easy life, but it was honest. The mountains did not pretend, they simply were ancient, indifferent, and enduring. And there was a strange comfort in that honesty after the lies of the house she had left behind. This was a place where a person could start over. This was a place where a person could build something that was their own. She adjusted the bag on her shoulder and began the long walk down into the valley. The settlement at the mouth of Whisper Creek was little more than a cluster of rough buildings huddled together against the vastness of the surrounding wilderness. A general store, a blacksmith's forge cold and dark at this hour, a half-dozen houses, none of them grand. A small church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the east as if the mountain winds had been slowly pushing it for years. The man who ran the general store also served as the land agent, the postmaster, and when the need arose, the unofficial magistrate of Whisper Creek Valley. His name was Horace Beckett. He was somewhere north of 70, with a face that looked like a topographic map of the surrounding mountains, all deep lines and weathered ridges and sharp watchful eyes peering out from beneath brows as thick and tangled as sagebrush. He was behind the counter when Clara pushed open the door, a bell above the frame announcing her arrival with a single tired chime. He peered at her over a pair of spectacles perched on the end of his nose, taking in the road dust on her clothes, the canvas bag, the quiet, steady expression on her face. "Lost?" he asked. His voice was dry and papery like leaves blowing across a porch. "No," Clara said, "looking for a place. Some land, a cabin if there is one." Horace grunted and reached beneath the counter, producing a large leather-bound book that he dropped on the surface with a thud that sent a small cloud of dust into the air. He opened it to a market page and ran a long bony finger down a column of entries. "Not much for sale. The Muella place is spoken for. Old logging camp is too far up canyon for anyone with sense." He paused, his finger stopping on an entry near the bottom of the page. "There is one property, the Caldwell place. Stone cabin, 5 acres, right on the creek. Been empty going on 10 years now." Clara felt a small electric jolt of recognition. The Caldwell place, the name on Amos's scrap of paper. "Why has it been empty?" she asked, though she already sensed the shape of the answer. Horace took off his spectacles and polished them on his shirt, holding them up to the lamplight to check for smudges. It was the gesture of a man who was deciding how much to say. "Bad luck follows that place," he said finally. "Robert and Helen Caldwell built it. Good people, strong people, had a boy, Tobias. Lost the boy to the winter fever in 97. A year later, Robert was killed in a rock slide at the old Stroud silver mine. Helen stayed on for another year alone. Then one day she was just gone, packed a bag and walked out. No one saw her again." He put his spectacles back on and looked at Clara with an expression that was part warning and part curiosity. Folks say the place holds on to its grief. They call it the cursed cabin. Nobody who's tried to live there since has stayed more than a season. Something about it drives people off. Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the house in Mill Creek, the white house with the green shutters that had once been full of her mother's voice and was now full of nothing but ledgers and locked doors. A house that held its grief silently, that buried its sorrow under columns of numbers and clean tablecloths and notes pinned to bags. A place that held its grief openly seemed more honest somehow, more fixable. How much? She asked. Horace looked at her worn dress, at the small bag at her feet, at the raw dust in her hair, and something shifted in his expression. Not pity exactly. More like the wary respect a man gives to a horse that is clearly too wild for its rider, but is going to try the jump anyway. County wants $12 for the deed, just to clear it from the books. He paused. There's one other thing you should know. Virgil Stroud, he owns the old silver mine up the North Fork. He's been asking about that land too. Wants to tear the cabin down, use the stone for a storage building. He hasn't paid, but he's not a man accustomed to being told no. $12. It was every cent Clara had in the world. Every coin she had saved from years of odd jobs, mending, cleaning, helping farmers with their harvests. If she spent it, she would have nothing, no margin, no safety net, nothing between her and starvation but the skills in her hands and the knife on her belt. I'll take it, she said, without hesitation, without a moment's pause. The way you step off a cliff when you know the only alternative is to stand on the edge forever. Horace stared at her for a long moment. Then he shrugged the shrug of a man who has lived long enough to know that the folly of youth is a force of nature as unstoppable and as unpredictable as a spring flood. And he filled out the deed in a spidery hand, and Clara counted out her $12 onto the worn wooden counter coin by coin until there was nothing left in her pocket but Prudence's note and Amos' scrap of paper. The cabin was a mile up the creek from the settlement. The path was overgrown, choked with thistle and wild blackberry and the sprawling, aggressive arms of older saplings that had been reaching for the light unchecked for nearly a decade. The sound of the creek was a constant companion, a low musical murmur that seemed to say something just below the threshold of understanding. And then she saw it. It was set back from the creek in a small clearing nestled against a stand of tall ponderosa pines, whose bark smelled like warm vanilla in the late afternoon sun. The foundation and lower walls were made of large, expertly fitted river stones, each one chosen and placed with a stonemason's eye locked against its neighbors in a pattern that was both functional and beautiful, a testament to Robert Caldwell's skill. The upper walls were sturdy logs, squared and notched at the corners, now grayed with weather but still sound. The sod roof was overgrown with grass and wild flowers, purple asters and goldenrod blooming in the last warmth of September, but beneath the vegetation the ridge pole looked straight and true. One window was broken, a dark gaping eye staring out at the clearing with an expression of blank surprise. The heavy plank door hung from a single leather hinge, crooked and gap-toothed like the jaw of an old man who has lost his fight with time. Weeds choked what had once been a small garden. A section of the stone wall had tumbled, spilling rocks into the yard like discarded teeth. The whole place had the air of something that had been holding its breath for a very long time, waiting for something, a storm, to finish it off, or a pair of hands to bring it back. Others would have seen a ruin, a place of bad luck and sorrow, a money pit, a fool's errand. Clara saw the good bones. She saw the precision of the stonework, each stone fitted without mortar, at the base dry stacked with the kind of skill that Amos would have recognized and respected. She saw the notched logs tight at the corners, the work of a man who understood that a building was only as strong as its joints. She saw a place that had been built with love and skill by hands that knew what they were doing. A place that was not falling down, a place that was simply waiting, waiting for someone who could see what it had been and imagine what it could become. She walked to the crooked door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust and damp earth and the faint, lingering scent of a long dead wood fire, a ghost of warmth trapped in the stone walls like a memory. It was the smell of a place that had been holding its grief inside the same way Clara had been holding hers. She stood in the dim light of the single room, surrounded by the work of a dead man's hands, and she felt something she had not felt since the morning her mother had reached out from the bed and tried to speak. She felt that she had come home. She set down her bag on the dusty floor. She slid the carving knife from its sheath and held it in her palm, feeling the warm, familiar curve of the apple wood handle against her skin. Then she looked around at the work that needed to be done. The broken window, the hanging door, the fallen wall, the cracked hearthstone, the years of neglect written in dust and cobwebs, and the small scattered bones of mice. And she felt something open inside her chest. Not happiness, not yet, but the thing that comes before happiness, the thing that makes happiness possible. Purpose. She had a place. She had her tools. She had the skills that a quiet old man had spent 11 years putting into her hands, one lesson at a time, one nod at a time, like a man planting seeds in a field he knows he will never see harvested. Now the work could begin. The first morning in the cabin, Clara woke before dawn. She had slept on the floor, curled on her side with the canvas bag beneath her head and her coat pulled over her like a blanket. The air was cold, colder than she had expected, and her breath hung in small white clouds that caught the first gray light filtering through the broken window. Every muscle in her body ached from 4 days of walking, and there was a stiffness in her lower back that made her wince when she sat up. But the ache felt honest. It was the ache of a body that had done something, that had carried itself across 100 miles of unfamiliar terrain to arrive at this place. It was not the ache of idleness or despair, it was the ache of beginning. She stood and looked around the cabin in the thin morning light. The room was roughly 16 feet square, with a sleeping loft above, reached by a ladder that was missing 2 rungs. The log walls were sound, but the chinking between them, the mixture of clay and moss and lime that sealed the gaps, had crumbled away in dozens of places, leaving narrow slits through which the mountain air whistled like a man calling a dog. The floor was packed earth, hard and smooth in the center where feet had worn it, but crumbling at the edges where moisture had crept in. Dust covered everything. The corners were thick with cobwebs, and the remains of several mouse nests were visible along the base of the walls, small sad piles of shredded leaves and dried grass and tiny scattered bones. The heart of the cabin was the hearth. It dominated the back wall, a massive construction of fitted river stone 5 feet wide and 4 feet tall, with a chimney that rose through the roof. Robert Caldwell had built it to last. The stonework was tight. The lintel was a single slab of granite that must have weighed 200 pounds, and the firebox was deep enough to hold logs 3 feet long. It was a hearth built for real winters, for the kind of cold that comes down from the mountains like a living thing and tries to get inside your bones. But the hearthstone itself, the flat slab of granite that formed the floor of the firebox, was cracked clean across the middle. The 2 halves had settled unevenly over the years, creating a gap wide enough to trap embers and a surface uneven enough to topple a pot. It was a house fire waiting to happen. Clara made a mental note: the hearth would need to be fixed before the first frost. Everything else could wait. The hearth could not. She spent the first hour sweeping. She had no broom, so she cut a bundle of willow branches from the creek bank and bound them with a strip of cloth torn from the hem of her spare shirt. The improvised broom was rough and inefficient, but it worked. Dust rose in thick clouds that turned the morning light amber and made her cough, and she propped the crooked door open to let the air move through. By noon, the floor was visible. By mid-afternoon, the cobwebs were gone. The mouse nests had been cleared, and the single room had begun to look less like a tomb and more like a space where a human being might actually live. The door was her next task. It was a heavy plank door, well made, built from 3 wide boards of white oak joined with iron cross braces. But the leather hinge on the upper corner had rotted through, leaving the door hanging at a drunken angle from the single surviving lower hinge. Every time the wind blew, the door swung and scraped against the stone threshold with a sound like a groan. Clara used Amos's knife to cut away the remnants of the rotted hinge. Then she walked to the old mine site, a quarter-mile up the creek, marked by a tumble of rusted equipment and collapsed timber framing, and spent 2 hours sorting through the debris until she found what she needed, a length of strap iron, rusted but still sound. She carried it back to the cabin, built a small fire in the yard, and spent the rest of the afternoon heating the iron in the coals, bending it with a rock and hammering it into a rough but functional hinge, using a flat stone as an anvil. When she hung the door that evening, it swung true. It closed with a solid, satisfying thud, and when she dropped the latch, a simple wooden bar that she carved from a piece of oak she found in the collapsed woodshed the door held. It did not rattle. It did not groan. It was a door that said, "Someone lives here, someone who intends to stay." She stood outside in the gathering dusk and looked at the closed door, and she felt a small, fierce spark of satisfaction that surprised her with its intensity. She had done this with her hands, with the skills Amos had given her, with scrap iron and creek stone and a knife with an applewood handle. She had made a door that worked. It was not much, but it was hers. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. She rose before dawn, built a small cook fire in the yard. She could not yet use the cracked hearth safely, and ate whatever she had. Creek water boiled. Wild greens she recognized from Ruth's teachings. Once a trout she caught with her bare hands in a shallow pool, the way she had seen Amos catch them, patient, still, then quick. She worked until the light failed, then she slept, and then she rose and worked again. She patched the roof first. The sod covering had held surprisingly well over the years. The grasses had rooted into the packed earth and created a living, self-maintaining surface, but there were 2 places where the underlying wood had rotted, leaving gaps that let in rain and starlight in equal measure. She wove mats of willow branches, layered them over the gaps, and packed them with fresh sod and clay from the creek bank, pressing the mixture into place with her hands until her fingers were raw and her arms shook with fatigue. The window came next. She spent 2 days carefully removing the broken shards of glass from the frame, a painstaking, dangerous job that left small cuts on her fingers despite her caution. She bought a new pane from Horace Beckett's store with the first dollar she earned, payment for a day of mending work she did for Horace's wife, a silent, bird-like woman who seemed astonished that anyone would voluntarily live at the Caldwell place. She fitted the new glass with strips of pine. She whittled to size, tapping them into place with the butt of her knife. When she was done, the window was whole. It caught the afternoon sun and held it, throwing a rectangle of warm light across the floor of the cabin like a golden rug. Each repair was small, each repair was necessary, and each repair changed the cabin in ways that went beyond the physical. A door that closed properly, a roof that kept out the rain, a window that let in light without letting in wind. These were not luxuries, these were the basic requirements of shelter, the minimum conditions under which a human being could survive a mountain winter. But to Clara, each one felt like an act of defiance. Each sealed gap, each replaced board, each straightened hinge was a statement directed at everyone who had ever dismissed her, underestimated her, or written her off. Prudence, who had looked at her and seen an expense. Harlan, who had signed her away without meeting her eyes. The people of Mill Creek, who had shaken their heads at the strange girl in the carpenter's workshop. Each nail she drove was an answer. Each joint she cut was a rebuttal. "I am here. I am capable, I am not going anywhere. It was on her ninth day in the valley that Virgil Stroud came. She heard the horse before she saw it, the heavy, deliberate clop of hoofs on the rocky path, a sound that carried authority even before the rider came into view. She was on the roof packing sod into a repaired section when the horse rounded the bend in the creek trail and stopped at the edge of her clearing. The man who sat in the saddle was perhaps 60, maybe older, with a broad, weathered face and a mustache that had gone from black to iron gray. He wore a good coat, not the rough canvas of a working man, but a wool broadcloth that had been tailored to fit, and his boots were polished, which struck Clara as absurd in a place where every path was mud and gravel. He sat the horse the way a man sits a throne, with the easy, unthinking posture of someone who is accustomed to looking down at the world. He did not dismount. He looked at the cabin, then at Clara on the roof, and his expression was the expression of a man who has found a stray cat sleeping in his favorite chair, amused, contemptuous, and faintly annoyed. "You the girl who bought the Caldwell deed?" he asked. His voice was deep and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never in his life needed to raise it. Clara set down the trowel she had been using and stood up on the roof so that she was looking down at him for once rather than up. She said, "My name is Virgil Stroud. I own the Silver Ledge mine. Owned it rather, it's been closed 5 years now, but I hold the mineral rights to most of this side of the valley." He said this the way a man recites his titles casually, but with the clear expectation that the listener will be impressed. "I know who you are," Clara said. "Mr. Beckett mentioned you." Something flickered across Stroud's face. Surprised perhaps that a 19-year-old girl with mud on her hands and sod in her hair would speak to him with so little deference. "Then he told you I had my eye on this parcel. He told me you hadn't paid for it." The flicker became a flash, a tightening around the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes. Stroud was not a man who was accustomed to being spoken to this way, least of all by a girl young enough to be his granddaughter, standing on the roof of a ruin with bare feet and a trowel in her hand. He leaned forward in the saddle. "Miss Whitfield, let me be direct. This valley is a hard place. Men with strong backs and full pockets have tried to make a go of it here and failed. The winters are brutal, the nearest doctor is 2 days' ride. The soil is thin, the growing season is short, and the creek floods every spring." He paused, letting each fact land like a stone dropped into still water. "A girl your age with no family, no resources, and no experience, you'll be gone before Christmas. And when you go, this property reverts to the county, and I'll buy it for what you paid. So why don't you save us both the trouble? I'll give you $20 for the deed right now. That's $8 more than you paid. You can walk back to wherever you came from with a profit in your pocket." Clara looked at him. She looked at his good coat and his polished boots and his well-fed horse. She looked at the easy confidence of a man who had spent his life acquiring things, land, mineral rights, other people's labor, and who could not imagine that anything he wanted might not be for sale. "No," she said. Stroud stared at her. "Excuse me. I said no, this is my land, I have the deed, and I am not leaving." The silence lasted several seconds. The horse shifted, sensing the change in its rider's posture. Stroud sat very still, and when he spoke again, the amusement was gone from his voice, replaced by something harder, something colder, something that Clara recognized from a lifetime of living with Prudence, the flat, efficient tone of a person who has decided that you are an obstacle to be removed. "You're making a mistake, Miss Whitfield," he said. "A girl of 19 alone on this mountain, no kin, no one to speak for you. This is not a place for someone playing at homesteading." He gathered his reins and turned the horse. "You'll change your mind. They always do." He rode away without looking back. Clara watched him until he disappeared around the bend, the sound of his horse's hoofs fading into the rush of the creek. Then she picked up her trowel and went back to work. But her hands were shaking, not from fear, from anger, from the cold recognition that she had just made an enemy of the most powerful man in the valley, and that he had the resources and the patience to make her life very difficult. The opposition was not limited to Virgil Stroud. On her second Sunday in the valley, Clara walked down to the settlement to buy salt and lamp oil from Horace's store. The little church with the leaning steeple was holding services, and the sound of a hymn drifted through the open windows and across the road. She did not attend, she had no Sunday dress, and in any case, she had never been much for church. Amos had taught her that God, if he existed, was more likely to be found in the grain of a well planed board than in the words of a sermon. But the sermon that morning, she would learn later, was about her. Pastor Josiah Crane was a tall, gaunt man with a voice like a bell struck with a hammer, resonant, unsubtle, and designed to carry. He had been the spiritual shepherd of Whisper Creek for 15 years, and he took a proprietary interest in the moral condition of his flock. That morning he had chosen to address what he called the spirit of recklessness that sometimes led young people astray. He did not mention Clara by name. He did not need to. Everyone in the congregation knew exactly who he was talking about when he spoke of a young woman unattached and unsupervised who had taken up residence in a place marked by sorrow and divine judgment. He spoke of the cursed cabin with the confidence of a man who believed that God's displeasure could be read in the fortunes of real estate. And he suggested, without quite saying so, that a woman living alone in such a place was courting not just physical danger but spiritual ruin. The effect was immediate and predictable. Several of the valley's families who might otherwise have been curious or even welcoming began to keep their distance. When Clara walked through the settlement, she noticed the averted eyes, the conversations that stopped as she approached the slight but unmistakable contraction of the community around a boundary that she was on the wrong side of. She had felt this before, the invisibility, the quiet exclusion. It was the same cold air that had filled her father's house after Ruth died, the sense of being present but unacknowledged, of occupying space without being granted the right to belong. But she had survived it once. She could survive it again. The cabin needed her more than the town did. The first act of sabotage came 3 weeks after Stroud's visit. Clara awoke in the middle of the night to a sound that was wrong, not the usual sounds of the mountain darkness, the creak, the wind, the occasional cry of an owl. This was a sharp, violent sound, the sound of something breaking. She grabbed the carving knife from beside her pillow and went to the door. The night was moonless and black, she could see nothing. But in the morning, when the light came, she found the damage. The door she had so carefully repaired had been wrenched from its hinges. Not by wind, the marks on the frame were the marks of a pry bar, deliberate and forceful. The door lay in the yard, the wood around the hinge points splintered and raw, and the stone-lined well she had been cleaning out, her only source of water apart from the creek, was choked with rocks. Large rocks too heavy for one person to have carried easily. It would take her 2 days to clear them. Clara stood in the yard looking at the ruined door and the fouled well, and she felt the anger rise in her chest like a fire being stoked. She did not scream, she did not cry. She walked around the cabin, slowly reading the ground the way Amos had taught her to read the grain of wood, looking for the story it was telling. She found boot prints, 2 sets, heavy treads, the kind of boots worn by working men. They led from the direction of the mine trail and returned the same way. She knew who had sent them. She could not prove it, but she knew. For a moment, just a moment, she considered walking down to the settlement and telling Horace Beckett what had happened, asking for help. But she stopped herself. Asking for help meant admitting vulnerability, and vulnerability was something that men like Virgil Stroud could smell the way a wolf smells blood. If she went to the settlement with a complaint, she would be confirming everything. Stroud had said that she was too young, too alone, too fragile for this place, that she needed protection, that she was in the end just a girl playing house. So she did not ask for help. She rehung the door alone. It took her most of the day because the hinge points were damaged, and she had to carve new ones from green oak, working the wood with her knife until her hands cramped and her shoulders burned. When it started to rain in the late afternoon, a cold driving rain that came down the valley like a curtain, she kept working. The rain soaked through her clothes and plastered her hair to her face, and the oak was slippery and hard to grip, and the knife slipped twice and cut her once on the thumb and once across the heel of her palm. She finished the door at dusk. She closed it behind her, dropped the latch, and stood in the dark cabin with the rain hammering the roof, and she pressed her bleeding hand against the solid closed door and felt something settle inside her. Not peace, not happiness, something harder and more durable than either, resolution. She would not be driven out, not by Stroud, not by the pastor, not by the valley's suspicion or the mountain's indifference. She had been driven out once. She would not allow it to happen again. She spent the next 2 days clearing the rocks from the well. She hauled them out one by one, her arms shaking with the effort, and stacked them neatly beside the cabin wall. She would use them later. Good stone should not be wasted. It was Emmett Harlow she caught first. She had taken to sleeping lightly, the carving knife within arm's reach, her ears tuned to any sound that did not belong to the night. One evening, just before full dark, she saw movement at the tree line on the far side of the clearing. A figure crouching, watching the cabin. She could not make out the face, but the silhouette was that of a young man, lean, angular, wearing the battered hat and the heavy coat of a mine worker. She did not hide. She walked out to the front door and straight across the clearing toward the figure, the knife in her hand, not raised, not threatening, but visible. "I know you're there," she said, her voice carrying clear and steady across the dusk. "And I know who sent you, so you can either come out and face me, or you can go back and tell Virgil Stroud that I saw you." I saw. A long pause. Then the figure stepped out from behind a pine tree, and Clara saw that he was young, no more than 20, maybe less. He had a narrow, sharp-featured face and eyes that darted away from hers like fish avoiding a net. His hands were at his sides, empty. "I wasn't doing nothing," he said. But his voice cracked on the last word, and Clara heard the lie in it the way she could hear a false note in a piece of struck wood. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated. Emmett Harlow." "You work for Stroud." Another hesitation. "I work at the mine. What's left of it? Maintenance mostly, keeping the timbers up." He looked at the ground, at his boots, at anything but her face. "He pays my wage, such as it is." Clara studied him. She saw the worn coat, the too thin frame, the way he stood hunched, defensive, the posture of a person who has spent his life taking orders and expecting blows. She recognized that posture. She had seen it in her own reflection in the years before Amos gave her a place to stand straight. "Did you wreck my door?" she asked. Not with accusation, with simple directness, the way you might ask someone if it was raining. Emmett's jaw tightened. He still would not meet her eyes. The silence between them stretched out, filled with the sound of the creek and the evening wind in the pines. "Yes," he said finally. The word seemed to cost him something. "Me and another fellow, Stroud told us to, said he wanted you discouraged." A pause. "I'm not proud of it." Clara looked at him for a long time. She thought about what it meant to be young and poor and dependent on a man like Virgil Stroud for your livelihood. She thought about what it meant to do things you were not proud of because the person who held power over you told you to. She thought about her father sitting at the dining table signing a paper because Prudence stood beside him and expected it. "I know what it's like," she said quietly, "to do what someone tells you because you don't think you have a choice." Emmett looked up at her then, for the first time, and something changed in his face, not much, just a slight softening around the eyes, a loosening of the jaw, the look of a person who has braced for a blow and received instead an open hand. "He wants the land," Emmett said, "not for the stone. He doesn't care about the stone. It's the water, the creek. He's got plans to reopen the mine, but he needs water access for the sluice operation. Your cabin sits right on the best stretch. Whoever holds this land controls the water." Clara filed this information away the way she filed away the properties of different woods, carefully, precisely for future use. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Emmett nodded, a quick, jerky movement. "I won't be coming back up here. Not for him. He turned to go, then stopped. You really going to stay through the winter? Yes. He looked at the cabin, at the mended roof, the rehung door, the cleared yard, and something that might have been respect crossed his face. He won't stop, Emmett said. Stroud, he doesn't know how. Neither do I, Clara said. Emmett almost smiled. Almost. Then he walked away into the darkening trees, and Clara went back inside and latched the door. She needed help with the hearth. This was not a failure of will or a concession to weakness. It was a simple acknowledgement of physics. The cracked hearthstone, a single massive slab of granite, weighed more than she did. Moving it safely, replacing it properly was a two-person job, possibly a three-person job. And the work had to be done right because a badly built hearth in a log cabin was not an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. She asked Horace Beckett who the best stonemason in the valley was. That would be Ezra Flint, Horace said, and the ghost of a smile touched his thin lips. Lives up the North Fork, man's hands are bigger than his head, and his head's the size of a pumpkin. But he knows stone the way most men know their own names. Clara found Ezra Flint working on a new foundation for the blacksmith's shop in the settlement. He was an older man, perhaps 60, perhaps more. It was hard to tell with men who had spent their lives working outdoors. His face was the color and texture of old saddle leather, and his hands were enormous, scarred, and gentle. He moved stone the way a pianist moves across keys with a precision that seemed impossible given the size of his instruments. She explained her problem, the cracked hearthstone, the need to replace it before winter. She expected to negotiate a price, to discuss terms, to arrange payment. Instead, Ezra set down the stone he was holding, wiped his hands on his trousers, and said, I knew Robert Caldwell, worked alongside him at the mine for 3 years. He was a good man and a better mason. His stonework at your place is some of the finest I've seen in this valley. He paused. I'll come take a look. He arrived at the cabin the next morning before sunrise carrying a leather tool roll and a jug of coffee. He spent the first hour simply examining the hearth, running his massive hands over the stones Robert Caldwell had laid, reading them the way a man reads a letter from an old friend. Good work, he murmured again and again, his fingers tracing the joints. Solid, tight, he knew what he was doing. Then he turned to the cracked hearthstone, and his expression changed. This has to come out, he said. The whole slab, a crack like this in this position, one hot fire and the stone splits, drops coals into the foundation and the whole cabin goes up. Robert must have known. Maybe he was planning to replace it before. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They worked together for 3 days. Ezra showed Clara how to mix lime mortar to the consistency he wanted, not with measurements but by feel. Like this, he said, working the mixture with his hands. See how it holds together but doesn't stick like wet sand at the edge of the ocean. That's what you want. He showed her how to use shims to level a stone, how to read the subtle grain of granite, to predict where it would fracture under stress, how to tool mortar joints for a clean, tight seal that would keep water out for decades. Clara listened, she watched, she learned, and Ezra, she noticed, was watching her in return, watching the way she handled tools, the way she studied each stone before placing it, the way she worked with the quiet, focused intensity of someone who has been trained by a master. Who taught you? He asked on the second day as they were wrestling a new stone into position. A man named Amos Birch, back in Mill Creek. Ezra nodded slowly. A carpenter? Yes. Good one. Clara thought about the dovetail joint and the nod and the chair by the window. The best I ever knew, she said. Ezra looked at her for a moment and then he did something that Clara did not expect. He smiled. It was a small smile barely visible beneath the weathering and the years, but it was real and it was warm, and it was the smile of a man who recognizes a kindred spirit, someone who speaks the language of hands and materials, of patient work done well. Robert would have liked you, he said. They lifted the cracked hearthstone together on the morning of the third day. Clara had found a long, sturdy log to use as a lever, and Ezra placed the fulcrum stone with the precision of a surgeon positioning a scalpel. They worked the slab up slowly, inches at a time, the massive stone groaning and grinding against its bed of sand and earth. And then the stone was free, and there in the hollowed out space beneath, where the center of the slab had rested, was something that did not belong, a small dark object, wrapped in oilskin, about the size of a loaf of bread, tied securely with twine, and placed with obvious deliberation in the center of the hollow. Clara and Ezra looked at each other. Ezra stepped back, his big hands raised, slightly palms out, the universal gesture of a man who wants it known that he is not touching what is not his. That's for you, he said quietly, that whatever it is, this is your hearth. Clara knelt. Her hands were trembling, not from exertion, though her arms ached from the morning's work, but from a sudden sharp premonition that she was about to discover something that would change the shape of her life. She carried the package to the doorway where the light was better. She used Amos's knife to slit the twine. She peeled back the stiff, waxy layers of oilskin, each one releasing a faint smell of age and preservation, the smell of something that has been kept safe for a long time. Inside was a small, neatly stacked pile of $20 gold coins. Their surfaces gleamed dully in the afternoon light, not bright, not showy, but solid, heavy, with the weight of real value. Beneath the coins was a folded letter, the paper yellowed with age, the ink faded to a soft brown. And resting beside the letter, as if someone had placed it there last as a kind of signature, was a single smooth, dark river stone, perfectly round, the kind a child might pick up from a creek bed and keep in his pocket because it felt good in his hand. Clara unfolded the letter. The handwriting was clear and steady, a woman's hand. It began, to whoever finds this in this house I built with my husband Robert. My name is Helen Caldwell. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world has not gone the way I had hoped. Clara sat down on the threshold, the cool stone beneath her, and she read. Helen wrote that she and Robert had come to the valley with their son Tobias, who was 6 years old. They built a cabin together, stone by stone, log by log. Robert was a stonemason, and he said the stones of this creek were the strongest he had ever worked with. For 5 years, the cabin was a happy place. Tobias loved the valley more than anywhere on earth. He spent his days exploring the creek, and his pockets were always full of treasures, smooth stones, bird feathers, strangely shaped twigs. The dark river stone in the package was his favorite. He called it his lucky stone. They were saving for his future, Helen wrote. Every spare dollar. Robert worked shifts at the silver mine, and Helen sold butter and eggs in the settlement. They dreamed of sending Tobias east to school to become a doctor or an engineer, to have a life bigger than this valley. The money, $180 in gold, was hidden under the hearthstone. It was Tobias's future kept safe beneath the heart of their home. Then came the winter of 1897. A fever took Tobias. He was gone in 3 days. The light went out of the house, out of their lives. Robert kept working, but something inside him had broken. He became reckless at the mine, taking risks he would never have taken before. The following spring there was a rock slide. He was gone too. Helen stayed for another year alone in the house they had built together, surrounded by the ghosts of the people she had loved and lost. She could not spend the money. It was Tobias's. It would always be Tobias's. And so she left it where Robert had hidden it under the hearth, and she wrote this letter, and she walked away from the valley to find a place where the memories were not in every stone and every gust of wind. The letter ended with a plea. Clara read it twice, the words blurring slightly as moisture gathered in her eyes. Not tears, not quite, but something close, something she had not felt since she was 7 years old and standing in the doorway of her mother's room. To whoever finds this, Helen Caldwell had written, I hope you are in need. I hope you are building a life here. Use this money to make this house a home again. Do not let this be a place of sorrow. Let it be a place of new beginnings, and please, if you have a moment, take Tobias's lucky stone down to the creek for him. Let it feel the water one more time. Clara sat for a long time on the threshold, the letter in her lap, the gold coins heavy in one hand, the small, cool river stone in the other. She understood now. The cabin was not cursed by spirits or by God's judgment, whatever Pastor Crane might preach. It was burdened with a grief so heavy that no one had been able to bear it. The previous tenants who had come and gone within a season, they had felt it. The weight of a family's shattered dreams pressed into the stones and the logs and the earth. They had felt it and they had fled from it because grief without purpose is unbearable. But Clara Whitfield knew something about grief. She had grown up inside it. She had watched it turn her father into a man who could sign away his own daughter without looking up from the table. She had learned in Amos Birch's workshop that grief could be transformed, not erased, not forgotten, but worked the way a carpenter works a difficult piece of wood with patience and respect, and the understanding that the grain cannot be forced, only followed. She looked around the cabin at the solid stone walls Robert had built at the hearth that had protected his family's future for nearly a decade, and she made a silent promise to the ghosts of the Caldwell family. She would not let this be a place of sorrow. She would build a new beginning for herself and for them. She looked at Ezra, who had been standing in the yard the whole time, his back turned, giving her privacy. I found something, she said simply, something the previous owner left behind, a letter and some money. Ezra nodded once. He did not ask how much. He did not ask to see the letter. Then it's yours, he said. Heart of the house, heart of the home. What's under the hearthstone belongs to whoever tends the fire. They finished the hearth that afternoon. 3 flat stones, perfectly fitted, perfectly level, sealed with mortar that Ezra pronounced satisfactory, the highest praise in his vocabulary. When they were done, Clara built the first fire in the new hearth. The flames climbed slowly, licking the fresh mortar, warming the stones, filling the cabin with a light and a heat that seemed to push the shadows back into the corners where they belonged. Ezra refused any payment. Call it a professional courtesy, he said, looking at the finished hearth with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done good work. For Robert. He left as the sun was setting, his tool rolled over his shoulder. At the edge of the clearing, he stopped and turned back. Your chimney draws well, he said, a good draught. Robert knew what he was doing. Then he was gone, walking into the trees with the slow, steady gait of a man who has nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. Clara sat alone by her fire in the cabin that was becoming her home, and she held the smooth, dark river stone in her palm and felt its weight and its coolness and the invisible thread that connected it to a boy she had never met. A boy who had loved this valley and this creek, a boy whose parents had hidden their hopes for him beneath the floor of the house they built with their own hands. She would honor them. She would honor all of them, Robert and Helen and Tobias and Amos, who had sent her here, and even Ruth, who had taught her to read the stars and know the birds and believe that the world, for all its cruelty, was still a place where stories could have good endings. But first, she had to survive the winter, and between her and spring stood Virgil Stroud, a man who wanted her water, her land, and her gone. The gold coins changed things. $180 was a small fortune, more money than Clara had ever seen, more than most families in the valley earned in a year. But it was not the money itself that mattered most. It was the purpose the letter gave it. She was no longer just a survivor seeking shelter. She was a custodian tasked with honoring a family's legacy, with turning their sorrow into something that could grow. The next morning she walked into the settlement with a new steadiness in her step. She went to Horace Beckett's store and placed a single gold coin on the counter. Horace's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline, but he asked no questions. The people of these mountains understood that money had stories attached to it and that the stories were not always meant to be told. She bought a good axe head, a sack of nails, a bag of lime, a dozen cedar shingles, and a 50-pound sack of flour. She carried them back to the cabin in 2 trips, and when she was done, She stood in the clearing and looked at the supplies stacked against the cabin wall and felt something she had not felt since the morning she had found the locked door and the note on the porch. She felt rich. Not in the way Virgil Stroud was rich with his mine and his broadcloth coat and his sense of entitlement. Rich in the way that matters, with a roof, a fire, a purpose, and enough resources to see it through. But Virgil Stroud had noticed the gold coin on Horace Beckett's counter. Little happened in Whisper Creek Valley that Virgil Stroud did not notice, and what he noticed he acted on. Within a week, the word had spread through the settlement. Virgil Stroud was telling people, not loudly, not publicly, but in the quiet, poisonous way that powerful men spread information they won't believe, that the girl at the Caldwell place had come into money, gold money. And he was asking in his reasonable, measured, deeply dishonest voice where a girl of 19 with no family and no income might have come by gold coins. He suggested, without quite saying so, that she had found them on land that fell within his mineral rights, that the gold, in other words, was his. It was a lie, and Stroud knew it was a lie. But it was the kind of lie that did not need to be true to do its damage. All it needed was to be repeated, and in a small community where suspicion already clung to Clara like wood smoke, repetition was easy to come by. Clara felt the change. The looks in the settlement grew longer and less friendly. Horace Beckett, who had been warming to her, became guarded and careful in his dealings. Even Nettie Greer, who had continued to bring bread and eggs despite the pastor's warning, seemed hesitant during her next visit, her kind eyes clouded with uncertainty. Clara said nothing. She did not defend herself. She did not explain the letter or the gold or the dead family's broken dreams. These things were private. They belonged to the cabin and to her, and she would not drag them into the public square to be examined and doubted and picked apart by people who had never lost everything and built it back with their own hands. But the accusation burned. It burned because it was an attack not on her property but on her character, on the one thing she had that no one had given her and no one could take away. Her honesty, her name, the quiet integrity that Amos had seen in her and nurtured and trusted. Virgil Stroud was not trying to take her land, not yet. He was trying to take something more fundamental. He was trying to take the community's trust, to isolate her, to make her so alone and so unwelcome that she would live on her own. And he almost succeeded. It was Emmett Harlow who tipped the balance. He came to the cabin on a cold evening in late November, his collar turned up against the wind, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his worn coat. He stood at the edge of the clearing and waited until Clara saw him and came to the door. "I need to tell you something," he said. He looked afraid, not of Clara, of what he was about to do, of the bridge he was about to burn. "Come inside," Clara said. He sat on the stool she had built from salvaged mine timber, and he told her everything. He told her that Stroud did not care about the gold or the mineral rights. He told her that Stroud wanted the water, the stretch of creek that ran through Clara's 5 acres, the only reliable water source for the sluice operation he planned if he reopened the mine. He told her that Stroud had been planning to acquire the Caldwell property for years, and that Clara's sudden appearance and her refusal to sell had thrown a wrench into plans that Stroud had considered already settled. He told her about the lie Stroud was spreading, and he told her that he was willing to say publicly that he had been the one who wrecked her door and fouled her well on Stroud's orders. Clara looked at him. "That would cost you your job," she said. "I know." "Why?" Emmett was quiet for a long time. He stared at his hands, young hands, calloused and scarred from mine work, hands that had done things he was ashamed of. "Because I watched you fix that door," he said, "in the rain, by yourself, with blood on your hands. And I thought, if she can do that after what I did to her, then maybe I can do one thing I'm not ashamed of." Clara felt something shift inside her. The same thing she had felt when Amos said the chair needed to be used. The same thing she had felt when Helen Caldwell's letter asked her to make the cabin a home. The recognition that even in a world full of locked doors and signed papers and cruelly reasonable men in broadcloth coats. There were people capable of choosing differently, of choosing to be brave when it would have been so much easier to be compliant. Thank you, she said. And the weight of the winter ahead, which had been pressing down on her shoulders like the massive Hearthstone she and Ezra had levered from its bed, felt suddenly fractionally more bearable. Winter came to Whisper Creek Valley the way a door closes in an empty house, slowly at first, then all at once, with a sound that echoed through everything. The first snow fell in early December, arriving not in gentle, tentative flakes, but in thick, silent curtains that erased the world in white. By morning, the valley floor was buried under a foot of powder, and the peaks on either side had disappeared, entirely swallowed by clouds so low and heavy they seemed to press down on the cabin roof like the palm of a vast hand. Clara had prepared. In the week since finding Helen Caldwell's letter, she had worked with a focus that bordered on fury. She split firewood until her arms could no longer lift the axe. Then she split more the next day. She stacked the wood against the cabin's south wall in rows so tight and straight that Amos would have given the nod cord after cord of seasoned pine and green oak enough to feed the hearth through 4 months of mountain cold. She packed the last of the chinking gaps with her clay and grass mixture, sealing the cabin against the wind that came down from the peaks like something with teeth. She built a crude but functional root cellar in the ground beside the cabin, lining it with flat stones and stocking it with potatoes, dried beans, salt pork, and cornmeal bought from Horace Beckett's store. She was ready, or as ready as a 19-year-old girl alone on a mountain could be. The cold was a thing she had not imagined. She had known cold in Mill Creek, the sharp, businesslike cold of a Pennsylvania winter, the kind that made your cheeks sting and your fingers stiff. But the cold of the Cobalt Mountains was a different creature entirely. It was patient, it was relentless, it found every weakness in the cabin's defenses, a gap in the chinking she had missed, a draft beneath the door, the single pane window that radiated cold like a block of ice set into the wall. At night, the temperature dropped so far that the water in the bucket by the hearth would skin over with ice by morning, even with the fire banked and glowing. Clara learned to sleep close to the hearth, wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned, with heated stones tucked against her body beneath the blanket. She learned to keep the fire burning through the night, waking every few hours to feed it, stoking the coals with a stick and laying on fresh wood with the careful, methodical movements of a person who knows that letting the fire die is not an option. She learned the sound the cabin made when the temperature dropped below zero, a deep, subtle groaning in the logs, the wood contracting, the joints tightening, the whole structure pulling itself inward like a man hunching his shoulders against a blow. There were mornings when the cold was so intense that she could not bring herself to leave the warmth of the hearth. She would sit on her three-legged stool, wrapped in her coat, her hands curled around a tin cup of coffee, a luxury she had allowed herself from Horace's store, and she would stare into the fire and feel the solitude press against her like a physical weight. She was alone, truly alone. In Mill Creek, even in the worst of it, there had been Amos. There had been the workshop, the smell of wood shavings, the quiet companionship of a man who understood silence as a form of conversation. Here there was no one. The settlement was a mile away, and in deep snow that mile might as well have been 50. Days passed without Clara hearing a human voice other than her own. She talked to herself sometimes, or rather she talked to the cabin. She talked to the walls Robert Caldwell had built, thanking them for holding. She talked to the hearth, telling it that its fire was strong and its stones were doing their job. She talked to the wind, asking it politely to find somewhere else to blow. It was not madness, it was the instinct of a social creature living in isolation, maintaining the habit of speech the way she maintained the fire, because letting it go out felt dangerous. But the solitude had a gift hidden inside it, the way the gold had been hidden beneath the hearthstone. In the long, silent hours by the fire, Clara began to think about her life with a clarity that the constant noise of surviving had not allowed. She thought about her mother and the green book and the names of stars. She thought about her father, not with the hot anger she had felt on the day he signed the paper, but with something more complicated, something that had pity in it and sorrow, and the beginnings of an understanding she was not yet ready to name. She thought about Amos. She thought about him every day. She wondered if he was warm, if his cough had gotten worse, if he was sitting in his workshop running his hands over a piece of wood with those slow, certain movements that had been the first reliable thing in her life. She wished she could write to him, but she had no address for him, and in any case, she did not know what she would say. Thank you was too small, and everything else was too large for paper. Nettie Greer appeared at the cabin door on a morning in mid-December, red-cheeked and breathing hard with snow in her hair and a basket on her arm. She had walked a mile from the settlement in knee-deep snow, and her skirt was soaked to the thighs. I brought you a ham, she said, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world, and some of my sourdough starter. You'll need it through the winter. Clara stared at her. You walked through that, she said, looking at the unbroken snow behind Nettie, the trench her body had carved through it. I've walked through worse. Nettie pushed past her into the cabin and set the basket on the table. She looked around at the tight chink in the clean swept floor, the sturdy furniture, the fire burning steady in the rebuilt hearth, and she nodded. The nod was different from Amos's nod, less spare, more open, but it carried the same weight. You've done good work here, she said. They sat by the fire and drank coffee, and Nettie talked about the valley, about the weather, about her husband Abel, who was a good man but snored like a freight train, about the spring planting, and the best variety of potato for mountain soil. It was the kind of talk that has no particular purpose, that exists simply to remind two people that they are not alone in the world, that there is another human being sitting across the fire who sees them and acknowledges their existence. When Nettie left, she paused at the door. Don't pay any mind to what Virgil Stroud is saying about you, she said. Most of us know a liar when we hear one. We just need a little time to remember our courage. Clara spent the rest of that day feeling warmer than the fire alone could account for. Ezra Flynn came by 3 days later carrying a wooden box under one arm. He stomped the snow from his boots on the threshold and handed Clara the box without ceremony. Inside was a set of tools, a draw knife and adze, a matched set of wood chisels, each one nesting in a leather pocket. The steel was old but well cared for, the handles worn smooth by decades of use. These were my father's, Ezra said. No use them sitting in my barn collecting mouse nests. A tool needs to be used. Clara took them with the same reverence she had felt when Amos gave her the carving knife. She understood the language of this gift. Tools were not given lightly. Tools were extensions of the hand, and the hand was the extension of the will, and the will was the deepest part of a person. To give someone your father's tools was to say, I trust you with my legacy. I believe you are worthy of the work these tools were made to do. Thank you, she said. Ezra grunted. Don't thank me, use them. He glanced at the hearth, their hearth, the one they had built together, and the ghost of his small smile appeared. Chimney still drawing well? Perfectly. Good, Robert would have approved. He turned to go, then stopped in the doorway. Stroud's been talking in the settlement, says he's going to bring a lawyer from the county seat after the thaw, says he's going to challenge your deed. Clara felt the familiar cold tightness in her chest. Let him, she said. Ezra looked at her, and for a moment the gruffness dropped away, and she saw the face of a man who had lived long enough to know that courage and foolishness often looked the same from the outside but felt very different from the inside. You're not alone in this, he said. Remember that. Then he was gone, trudging back through the snow toward the North Fork, his broad back receding into the white landscape like a boulder being slowly buried by the drift. The confrontation came in March when the first warm winds began to loosen winter's grip on the valley and the creek swelled with snow melt until it roared like a living thing. Virgil Stroud rode into the settlement one morning with a man in a dark suit beside him on a rented horse. The man was a lawyer from the county seat, thin and pale, and profoundly uncomfortable on horseback. They dismounted outside Horace Beckett's store, and Stroud's voice carried across the muddy street as he announced to anyone within earshot that he was here to settle the matter of the Caldwell property once and for all. Clara was in the store when they arrived. She had come to buy seed for the garden she was planning. She did not flinch when the door opened and Stroud walked in, filling the small space with his broadcloth coat and his proprietary air. She did not move from the counter. She simply turned and looked at him the way you look at a storm that has been threatening the horizon all day and has finally arrived. Miss Whitfield, Stroud said, "I believe you know why I'm here." "I do," Clara said. The lawyer produced a sheaf of papers from a leather case and began to speak in the careful, bloodless language of the law. He talked about mineral rights and subsurface claims and easement provisions dating back to the original Stroud mining charter. He talked about water rights and riparian access and the legal precedent for eminent domain in cases of economic development. He talked for a long time, and when he was finished, the sum of what he had said was this: Virgil Stroud believed he had a legal claim to Clara's land, or at least to what lay beneath it and what flowed through it, and he intended to press that claim in court. Clara listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She did not argue. When the lawyer was finished, she turned to Horace Beckett. "Mr. Beckett," she said, "would you be kind enough to show this gentleman the deed book?" Horace, who had been watching the proceedings with the expression of a man who has seen a great many things in his 70-odd years and has learned that the most interesting ones are the ones that surprise him, reached under the counter and produced the leather-bound book. He opened it to the page where Clara's deed was recorded and laid it on the counter. "The deed is clear," Clara said, speaking not to the lawyer but to the room, to Horace, and to the half-dozen other people who had drifted into the store drawn by the commotion. 5 acres, paid in full, registered with the county. The property includes all surface rights and structures. "The mineral rights," the lawyer began. "The mineral rights were granted under the Stroud Mining Charter of 1893, Clara said. She had spent the long winter nights reading not just her mother's green book, but every document related to her property that Horace Beckett had in his files. She had read them by firelight, slowly, carefully, the way Amos had taught her to examine a piece of wood before putting a blade to it. That charter expired in 1899 and was never renewed. Mr. Beckett has the county records to confirm it. As for the water rights under Pennsylvania common law, the owner of the land through which a natural waterway passes holds riparian rights to that water. No easement was ever filed." The silence in the store was so complete that Clara could hear the creak of the floorboards under Horace Beckett's shifting weight. The lawyer looked at Stroud. Stroud's face had gone the color of old brick. He had not expected this. He had expected a frightened girl, a stammer in denial, a tearful retreat. He had not expected someone who had done her homework. But Clara was not finished. She looked past Stroud to the doorway where Emmett Harlow was standing, hat in hands. His narrow face, tight with a resolve that Clara could see, was costing him everything he had. "Mr. Harlow," she said, "would you tell these people what you told me?" Emmett stepped forward. His voice shook, but the words came out clear. He told them about the door. He told them about the well. He told them that Virgil Stroud had ordered both acts of sabotage and that he, Emmett Harlow, had carried them out and that he was ashamed. The room turned to look at Virgil Stroud the way a compass needle turns toward north, slowly, inevitably drawn by a force that cannot be resisted. Stroud said nothing. There was nothing to say. The lawyer closed his leather case with a snap that sounded in the silence like a gunshot. He murmured something about reviewing the county records and excused himself, and everyone in the room understood that he would not be back. Stroud looked at Clara. In his eyes, she saw something she had not expected. Not anger, not hatred, bewilderment. The genuine disoriented confusion of a man who has played a game his entire life and has always won, and who is now looking at the board and realizing that he has lost to someone who was never supposed to be playing at all. He turned and walked out of the store. He mounted his horse and rode away, and Clara watched him go through the store window, watched the broadcloth coat and the polished boots diminish down the muddy road until they were just a dark smudge against the gray spring landscape. He did not come back, not that day, not the next, not ever. By summer word had reached the valley that Virgil Stroud had sold his mining claims to a company from Pittsburgh and moved to Denver. His name faded from conversation the way boot prints fade from a trail after rain, slowly then completely, until it was as if he had never been there at all. Pastor Josiah Crane arrived at the cabin on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. Clara saw him coming from the garden. She was turning, a tall, gaunt figure walking up the creek path with something tucked under his arm. She straightened up and waited, the hoe in her hands, the spring sun warm on her back. He stopped at the edge of the clearing. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the cabin, at the straight hanging door, the patched roof, the clean window catching the light, the new garden rose, dark with freshly turned earth. He looked at the place the way a man looks at evidence that contradicts something he has been preaching for years. Then he walked forward, and Clara saw what he was carrying. It was a small tree, an apple sapling, its roots wrapped in burlap, its branches bare but budding with the first green promise of spring. He held it out to her. He did not say, "I was wrong." He did not say, "I am sorry." He did not need to. The tree said it for him. An apple tree is a long-term proposition. It takes years to bear fruit. You do not plant one for a person you expect to leave. Clara took the sapling. She looked at the pastor's face, gaunt, weathered, marked by years of certainty that was now cracking around the edges, and she saw a man who was trying to do a difficult thing without the words to do it. She recognized that struggle. She had lived it. "Thank you," she said. "I'll plant it by the south wall. It'll get the best light there." Crane nodded stiffly. He turned to go, then stopped. "Miss Whitfield," he said without turning around, "the curse. There is no curse. There never was, just people who were hurting, and other people who didn't know how to help." He paused. "I should have known the difference." He walked away down the creek path, and Clara stood in her garden holding the apple tree, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not even realized was tight. The town had not simply accepted her, it had acknowledged her. It had looked at the work of her hands and seen what Amos had always seen, not a strange girl, not an inconvenience, not a line item in someone else's ledger, but a person of substance, a person who belonged. The people of Whisper Creek stopped calling the place the Caldwell cabin or the Cursed cabin. When they gave directions now, they said, "Go on, past Clara Whitfield's place." She had a name, and her name was attached to a home, and the home was attached to a community that had decided quietly and without ceremony that she was one of them. The letter arrived in May, carried by the mail rider who came through the valley once a month when the roads were passable. Horace Beckett held it out to Clara when she came to the store for salt and coffee. It was a plain envelope, slightly crumpled from its journey, addressed in handwriting that Clara recognized immediately, not the sharp, economical script of Prudence, the neat, careful penmanship of a clerk. Her father's hand. She took the letter back to the cabin. She sat on the threshold, the same spot where she had read Helen Caldwell's letter months before, and she opened it. "Dear Clara," it began, and already the word dear stopped her. Helen Whitfield had never called her dear in all the years she could remember. The word sat on the page like a stone that had been rolled away from the mouth of a cave, revealing something that had been sealed inside for a very long time. He wrote that Prudence was dead, pneumonia over the winter. She had been ill for weeks, and when the end came, it was quick. He wrote this without sentiment in the same factual ledger entry style that he used for everything. But then the handwriting changed. The letters became less precise, more hurried, as if the pen were moving faster than the hand could control. He wrote that the house was empty, that the silence in it was different now, not the busy, efficient silence of Prudence's management, but a deeper silence, the silence of a man who is alone with the consequences of his choices. He wrote that he had been sitting at the dining table one evening in the same chair where he had signed the paper, and he had looked at the chair across from him where Clara used to sit, and he had understood for the first time what he had done. He did not use the word sorry. He circled around it, approached it, retreated, approached again, the way a man who has never learned to swim circles the edge of a lake. He wrote that he knew he had no right to ask anything of her. He wrote that he understood if she never wanted to hear from him again, but he wanted her to know that he was thinking of her, that he hoped she was well, that he and here the handwriting became almost illegible, as if the pen were trembling in his hand, that he wished he had been stronger. At the very bottom of the letter, almost as an afterthought, written in letters so small they were barely legible, were four words, "May I visit you?" Clara read the letter 3 times. She held it in her hands and felt the weight of it, not the physical weight of paper and ink, but the emotional weight of a man who had spent his entire life hiding behind numbers and neat columns and the safe, orderly fiction that the world could be managed if you just kept the accounts straight, and who was now at last trying to say something real. She did not cry, but she came close. Closer than she had come since the day she found the locked door and the note on the porch. Closer than she had come since the night she lay in the woodcutter's shed and named the stars for her dead mother. She folded the letter carefully and carried it inside. She placed it on the shelf beside the hearth, the small shelf she had built with mortise and tenon joints, the shelf that held the two objects that defined her life. Amos's carving knife with its applewood handle worn to a deep familiar patina, the tool that had allowed her to begin. Tobias Caldwell's lucky stone, smooth and dark and cool to the touch, the gift that had allowed her to build. And now between them she placed her father's letter, the question she had not yet answered, 3 objects on a shelf, a skill, a purpose, and an unresolved wound. The whole of her life contained in a space no wider than her arm span. She would write back. She knew that. She would not write today or tomorrow or perhaps even this month. She would write when she was ready, in her own time, at her own pace. She was done living on other people's timelines, done being managed, dismissed, signed away, cast out. If Holland Whitfield wanted to be part of her life, he would have to wait. He would have to earn the right. And the first thing he would have to earn was her belief that his remorse was more than just the loneliness of a man who had lost his housekeeper. But she would not lock the door. She knew what a locked door felt like. She knew the cold, smooth weight of standing on the wrong side of one, reading a note that reduced your entire existence to an inconvenience. She would not do that to another person, not even to the man who had done it to her. The door would stay open, not because he deserved it, but because she chose it, because choosing to leave a door open when you have every right to slam it shut is the most powerful thing a person can do. It is the act of someone who is no longer afraid. It was on a still afternoon in late May that Clara fulfilled the last part of her promise to Helen Caldwell. The valley was in full bloom. The meadows along the creek were thick with wild flowers, columbine and Indian paintbrush, and the tiny white stars of mountain chickweed. The apple sapling pastor crane had given her had leafed out its small green leaves, trembling in the breeze like the hands of a child reaching for something just out of grasp. The air smelled of pine sap and warm earth and the cold, clean mineral scent of snow melt still running in the creek. Clara took the smooth, dark river stone from the shelf. She held it in her palm as she walked down the slope to the water's edge. It was warm from the cabin, warm from the fire that had burned beside it all winter, and it seemed to pulse against her skin with a faint borrowed life. She knelt at the creek. The water was clear and fast running over a bed of colored stones, gray and brown and white, and the deep, surprising blue of glacial cobalt that gave the mountains their name. She could see her own reflection in the current, broken and reassembled by the moving water, never quite the same face twice. She lowered her hand into the creek. The cold was a shock, a bright, clean, living cold that made her gasp. She held the stone in the current and let the water rush over it, around it, the way it had rushed over it on the day a boy named Tobias had first picked it up from this same creek bed and decided it was lucky. She didn't say any words aloud. She was not sure she believed in the power of spoken words to reach the dead. But she believed in the power of kept promises, and this was a promise kept, the last line of Helen Caldwell's letter, the last request of a mother who had lost everything and asked only that someone someday would take her son's favorite stone back to the water. She held the stone in the creek for a long time, long enough for her hand to go numb, long enough for the cold to travel up her arm and settle in her chest, where it mixed with the warmth that was already there, the warmth of the fire, the warmth of the work, the warmth of the people who had shown up for her when they didn't have to. Then she lifted the stone from the water. It was clean now, dark and gleaming, the creek having washed away the years of dust and firelight and fingerprints. She dried it on her sleeve and carried it back to the cabin and placed it on the shelf in its spot between the knife and the letter. It had felt the water one more time. The promise was kept. That evening, Clara cooked supper in her cabin. Stew, venison, and potatoes and wild onions simmered in the iron pot that hung over the hearth on the crane she had forged herself from scrap iron. The smell filled the single room, rich and savory and deeply fundamentally good. The fire burned steady, the rebuilt hearthstone radiating a warmth that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the flames, as if the stones themselves remembered all the fires that had ever been lit upon them and were giving that accumulated warmth back to the room. Ezra Flynn sat at the table, his massive hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. Nettie Greer sat across from him, telling a story about a rooster that had chased her husband Abel clear across the barnyard that morning, a story she told with such dry, matter-of-fact delivery that even Ezra's weathered face cracked into a grin. Clara listened, stirring the stew, and she felt the cabin full around her, full of voices, full of warmth, full of the smell of food and the sound of laughter and the creaking of the chair legs on the hard-packed floor. The cabin that had been empty for 9 years, the cabin that people said was cursed. The cabin that held the grief of a family that had loved too much and lost too fast. It was not empty anymore, it was not cursed, it was alive with the thing that had been buried beneath the hearthstone all along, not gold, though the gold had been there too. Hope. The fierce, stubborn, unreasonable hope of a woman who had lost everything and still believed that someone someday would come along and make the house a home again. After supper, after Ezra and Nettie had gone, Clara stood in the doorway of her cabin and looked out at the valley. The last light was draining from the sky, pooling in the west like liquid gold behind the dark silhouette of the peaks. The creek murmured its endless, patient song. A hawk circled high overhead, riding the last turmoil of the day, turning in slow, wide arcs against the deepening blue. She thought about the journey that had brought her here. $12 in a canvas bag and a locked door. 4 days of walking. A cabin that everyone said was cursed. A hearthstone that hid a dead family's broken dreams. A man who tried to take what was hers. A community that had watched and waited and finally decided she was one of them. She thought about Amos Birch, his gnarled hands, his slow nod, the way he had set a block of pine and a knife on a stump and waited for her to pick them up. The way he had said the chair needed to be used. The way he had pressed a scrap of paper into her hand with a destination written on it, knowing he was sending her toward a life he would never see. She reached into the pocket of her coat and touched the scrap of paper that was still there, folded and refolded along the same creases until the writing was nearly worn away. Whisper Creek Valley, 2 words in blocky handwriting that had saved her life. And then she thought about something she had not allowed herself to think about in months because the thought was too large and too sharp and too heavy to carry while she was also carrying firewood and hearthstones and the weight of Virgil Stroud's ambition. She thought about Amos's hands trembling. She thought about the cough he had tried to hide. She thought about the way he had held her briefly, lightly, one hand on the back of her head, with the tenderness of a man saying goodbye to someone he knew he would not see again. It was 3 weeks later that the second letter arrived. This one was not from her father. It was from a woman named Mrs. Lucinda Pratt, who identified herself as a neighbor of Amos Birch in Mill Creek, Pennsylvania. The letter was written in a round, careful hand, and it was brief. She regretted to inform Miss Whitfield that Mr. Amos Birch had passed away on the 14th of April. He had been ill for some time, a disease of the lungs, the doctor said, though Amos had refused treatment and had continued working in his shop until the very end. He had died in his chair, Mrs. Pratt wrote. Not Jonas's chair, his own chair at his workbench with a half-finished piece of work in front of him and his tools laid out in their proper order. In his will, he had left his workshop and all its contents to Clara Whitfield of Whisper Creek Valley. Mrs. Pratt had packed the tools into crates and sent them by freight wagon. They would arrive before the summer was out. There was one more thing, Mrs. Pratt wrote. Tucked into the will was a small piece of paper folded many times with a note written on it in Mr. Birch's hand. She had enclosed it with the letter. Clara unfolded the note, 5 words in the blocky handwriting she knew better than her own. Goodwood don't need paint. Clara sat on the threshold of her cabin and held the note in both hands and cried. She cried for the first time since she was 7 years old, standing in the doorway of her mother's room, watching the breath leave Ruth Whitfield's body. She cried the way a dam breaks, not slowly, not gracefully, but all at once, the whole structure giving way under the accumulated weight of everything it had been holding back. She cried for Amos, who had seen her when no one else had, who had given her his skills and his faith and his son's empty chair. She cried for Helen and Robert and Tobias Caldwell, whose love and loss were woven into the stones of the walls around her. She cried for her mother, who had taught her the stars. She cried for herself, for the girl who had stood on a porch with a locked door behind her and a note pinned to her back and had not allowed herself to break because breaking was a luxury she could not afford. She could afford it now. She had a home, she had a hearth, she had walls that held and a door that she controlled and a community that knew her name. She had earned the right to break, and so she broke, and the breaking did not destroy her. It released her. It emptied her of the weight she had been carrying since she was 7 years old, and when it was over, when the tears had stopped and her breathing had steadied, and the evening light was coming through the window and lying across the floor in a long golden rectangle, she felt lighter than she had ever felt in her life. She understood now what Amos had done. The years of teaching, the knife, the chair, the scrap of paper with the name of a valley written on it. He had not been merely preparing her for the day she would be cast out. He had been building her. The way he built a chair or a table or a door frame, carefully, patiently, joint by joint, making sure each piece was strong enough to bear the weight it would be asked to carry. He had spent 11 years building Clara Whitfield, and then he had sent her out into the world to be used the way a good tool is meant to be used, the way Jonas's chair was meant to be used, the way a life is meant to be used fully, honestly, without apology. Good wood don't need paint. She placed the note on the shelf beside the knife and the stone and her father's letter. 4 objects now, 4 pieces of a life that was still being built, still being shaped, still finding its grain. She stood up and wiped her face with her sleeve. She looked around the cabin at the walls, the hearth, the window, the door, at the shelf with its 4 small artifacts, at the fire burning low in the firebox, its coals glowing like the heart of something ancient and patient and good. She had been 19 years old when she walked into this valley with nothing. She was still 19, not even a year had passed. But the girl who had walked through that door with a canvas bag and $12 was not the woman who stood here now. That girl had been carrying the weight of a locked door and a signed paper and the silence of a father who would not look up. This woman was carrying something different, something lighter and stronger and infinitely more durable. She was carrying the knowledge that a home is not given, it is built, not just with stone and timber and iron nails, but with the slow daily accumulation of small acts. A fire tended, a door rehung, a promise kept, a hand extended, a letter placed on a shelf and left unanswered until the time is right. She walked outside. The valley was quiet in the late light. The creek sang its low, endless song. The peaks stood against the sky like sentinels, ancient and patient, watching over the small human settlement below with the same impassive attention they had given to everything that had happened in this place for 100,000 years. Smoke rose from the chimney of Clara Whitfield's cabin, a thin, steady plume that caught the last light of the sun and turned to gold against the darkening sky. It rose straight and true the way smoke rises from a hearth with a good draught built by hands that knew what they were doing. Inside the fire burned, and the walls held, and on a small wooden shelf beside the hearth 4 objects sat side by side in the firelight: a knife, a stone, a letter, and a note, each one a chapter in a story that was not yet finished. But the foundation was laid, and the foundation was strong.